There is a door inside Clarence house that most people in Britain do not know exists. It sits at the end of a corridor that smells of old wood and older secrets, and it is guarded not by a camera, not by a keypad, but by a man. A single man in a uniform, so pressed it looks like it was ironed by God himself. He stands there every morning before the house wakes up. He stands there when the house goes to sleep. And he stands there in the moments that fall between, the ones nobody puts in official records, the ones that slip through the cracks of palace logs and press releases and carefully worded statements. His name was Corporal James Ellery. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, he did something that shook the quiet interior of one of the most powerful households in the world. He said no, not in a loud voice, not with a clenched jaw or a drawn weapon. He said it the way a wall says no, with stillness, with weight, with the particular kind of silence that tells you, before a single word is spoken, that this conversation is already over. He said no to Camilla, the woman who would, within 2 years of that morning, become Queen of England. He said no to her face in that corridor that smelled of wood and secrets, and he did not flinch. He did not apologize. He did not step aside. He had his orders. And the orders had come from someone whose word, inside that house, sat above everything else, above rank, above title, above the polished social machinery that kept the royal household running like a clock that nobody was allowed to touch. The orders had come from the Prince of Wales. What happened in that corridor, what was said, what was not said, what Camilla did with her hands and her eyes, and the particular stillness of a woman who has spent decades learning how to absorb humiliation without letting it show. That is a story the palace never told. This is that story, not because it ended with scandal, not because blood was drawn or crowns were toppled, but because in a world built entirely on the performance of deference, one man, ordinary, unremarkable, standing in a corridor at 7 a.m, chose duty over comfort, and in doing so, changed everything. Corporal James Ellery had been standing in corridors his entire adult life, and he was good at it in the way that only men who genuinely do not mind their own company can be. He did not fidget. He did not drift. He did not let his eyes wander to the portraits on the wall, though the portraits were extraordinary. Men in red coats, women with pearls the size of knuckles, horses painted with more dignity than most living politicians. He looked straight ahead. That was the job. That was if you stripped away the uniform and the title and the careful language of the Royal Household Staff Handbook, the entire job. Stand. Watch. Hold the line. He had been assigned to Clarence House 14 months earlier, transferred from a posting at Windsor that had been, by all accounts, uneventful. His record was clean. His commanding officer had described him in an evaluation as possessed of excellent situational awareness and outstanding composure under pressure, which in the language of military assessments meant that James Ellery did not panic, did not gossip, and did not cause trouble. These were, inside the royal household, qualities rarer and more valuable than anything hanging on those walls. He was 31 years old. He had a sister in Bristol who called him every Sunday and asked when he was going to meet someone nice. He drank his tea without sugar because he had given it up the previous January for reasons he could no longer entirely remember. He owned 4 identical pairs of black socks. These were the facts of his life, small, orderly, unremarkable, and he was on the whole comfortable with them. The posting at Clarence House had been explained to him as a standard rotation. He would serve as one of 3 guards assigned to the private residential corridor on the upper floor, the corridor that separated the Prince of Wales's private study and personal rooms from the rest of the house. It was not glamorous duty. It was not the forecourt at Buckingham Palace, where tourists pressed their faces against iron railings and took photographs. It was a corridor, carpeted in blue, lit with wall sconces that gave everything a warm, slightly underwater quality. It smelled of beeswax and, on certain mornings when the kitchen was running early, of toast. The 3 guards rotated in 8-hour shifts. There was never, in 14 months, anything remarkable to report. Until the Tuesday. The first thing James noticed that morning was that the house felt different. He could not have said exactly how. The house itself was unchanged. Same carpet, same portraits, same watery light from the sconces. But there was something in the air, a kind of atmospheric pressure that he had learned over years of standing in important rooms to read the way sailors read the sky. Something was coming. He had received his briefing at 6:45 that morning, before taking his position. It was delivered by a man named Henderson, the senior household coordinator, who had the manner of a man permanently on the edge of a headache. Henderson delivered briefings with the efficiency of someone who had memorized the script long ago and now resented having to perform it. He ran through the day's schedule. The Prince of Wales had a private engagement in the morning, a call with an overseas official, not to be interrupted or disclosed. The household staff were to maintain standard protocol. No admittance to the upper residential corridor between 7 and 10 without prior clearance. Then, Henderson had paused. He was not a man who paused. He looked at James with the expression of someone selecting words the way you select footing on uncertain ground. He said that the prince had additionally requested, and here Henderson's jaw had done something complicated, a small muscular event that conveyed a great deal without conveying anything specific. That access to the corridor be restricted to cleared personnel only. All personnel. No exceptions. The prince had been, Henderson said, very clear about that. James had nodded. He understood the language. All personnel. No exceptions. In a household built on hierarchy and rank, those two words, no exceptions, were seismic. They meant someone was expected to try. He took his position at 7 o'clock. The corridor was empty. The house was quiet. The morning light pressed against the tall window at the far end, pale and thin, the specific color of an English October that cannot quite decide whether to commit to winter. He stood. He watched. He waited. She arrived at 7:22. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps exactly, but a quality of movement, a purposefulness that preceded her down the staircase like a bow wave. Camilla Parker Bowles, the Duchess of Cornwall, came around the corner of the corridor at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be and had already, internally, arrived there. She was dressed for the day, not formally, not in the silk and brooch configuration of public appearances, but in the particular way of a woman who understands that even informal is a presentation. A dark jacket, good shoes, hair that managed to look both natural and considered. She was carrying, of all things, a folder. Burgundy leather. It was tucked under her arm with the ease of something she carried often. She saw him. He saw her. For a half-second, neither of them moved, and in that half-second James felt the full weight of what was about to happen settle across his shoulders like a yoke. She walked toward him. He did not move. She stopped perhaps 4 feet away. The polite distance, the distance of corridors and waiting rooms and conversations that have not yet declared their nature. She looked at him, not unkindly, not with the cold theatrical remove that the tabloids sometimes projected onto her. She looked at him the way a practical woman looks at an obstacle she intends to move efficiently, without drama or damage. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness." A pause. She shifted the folder slightly under her arm. "I need to see him. I'm afraid I cannot permit access to the corridor at present, Your Royal Highness. The prince has requested that the corridor remain restricted until 10 o'clock. Something moved across her face. Not anger. Not quite. It was more like the expression of a person who has just been told that the train is delayed and is deciding in real time whether to argue with the schedule board. "I'm aware of his schedule," she said. "This is important. I understand, Your Royal Highness. My orders are to permit no access without prior clearance." Those orders came directly from the prince. She looked at him for a moment. He did not look away. This was not insolence. His eyes were steady and respectful, his posture correct, his tone entirely without aggression. He was not challenging her. He was simply a wall, a very polite wall, a wall that had been placed there by someone whose authority in this corridor, at this moment, superseded even hers. "Corporal Ellery, Your Royal Highness." Corporal Ellery. She said his name as if filing it carefully. "I think you may not fully appreciate the nature of what I need to discuss with him." "With respect, Your Royal Highness, The nature of the matter doesn't change my orders. Another pause. Longer this time. She looked past him, just briefly, at the corridor behind, at the blue carpet and the watery light and the closed door at the far end. Then, she looked back at him. "Is he all right?" she asked. And it was the way she asked it. Quietly, the public-facing layer stripped back for just a second, something unperformed underneath that made James understand something he had not fully understood before. This was not a power play. This was not a woman testing authority for the pleasure of testing it. She was worried. "The prince is well, your royal highness," he said. And he said it with a gentleness he had not planned to deploy. "He is occupied with a scheduled engagement." He gave his instructions this morning himself. She absorbed this. Her face did a small, private thing, a compression, a settling, and then she became again entirely composed. She shifted the folder back under her arm. "Very well," she said. She looked at him one moment longer. He held her gaze, not defiantly, just steadily, and in that steadiness there was, he thought, a kind of respect that ran in both directions. He was doing his duty, and she was in the end accepting it. She turned. She walked back down the corridor the way she had come, her footsteps even and unhurried, and she rounded the corner and was gone. James stood, exhaled through his nose, looked at the blue carpet, the watery light, the closed door. His tea, left on the small folding table at the side of his post, had gone cold. He didn't notice. He was thinking about the way she had asked that one question, "Is he all right?" And what it meant to care about someone in a house where everything, every interaction, every request and refusal was conducted in the language of protocol. He thought about it for a long time. The corridor stayed empty. The morning pressed on, slow and quiet, and the house held its breath around him. And somewhere behind that closed door, the Prince of Wales did whatever he had locked the corridor to do. And the day moved forward the way days do in places like this. Not with drama, not with noise, but with the immense, grinding, invisible weight of consequence. James stood. He watched. He held the line. That was the job. That was always the job. But something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in weather. Not yet visible, not yet arrived, but present already in the quality of the air. Something that had been balanced, that had been in careful equilibrium for a long time, was moving. He didn't know yet what it was. He would know, by the end of the week, exactly what it was. But that Tuesday morning, in the corridor that smelled of beeswax and the ghost of toast, Corporal James Ellery stood his post, held his orders, and said no to the woman who would be queen. And the house around him, old, heavy, full of portraits of people who had made far more consequential decisions in far more consequential corridors, did not shake. It waited. It had been waiting for this for a long time. There are houses that hold their stories the way old wood holds heat, slowly absorbed, slowly released, and always there beneath the surface if you know how to put your hand against the right wall and feel for it. Clarence House was one of those houses. It had seen things. It had kept things. It had watched generations of careful people do uncautious things in its rooms and swallowed the evidence with the patient appetite of a place that knows it will outlast everyone inside it. The staff knew it. You could see in the way they moved through the corridors, slightly aware, slightly conscious of the walls. New staff sometimes made the mistake of treating it like an office. They stopped making that mistake within the first month. It was not an office. It was a living thing, and it had moods, and on certain mornings like this one, it pressed down on you with a particular density of impending change. Henderson appeared at 9:53, 7 minutes before the corridor restriction was set to lift. He appeared, as Henderson always appeared, from slightly nowhere, emerging from side door with the particular expression of a man who has already processed 3 small crises before breakfast and is prepared for a 4th. He looked at James. "Everything quiet?" The Duchess came at approximately 7:22. James said. She wished to access the corridor. I informed her of the restriction. She accepted and withdrew. Henderson's face did the jaw thing again. More pronounced this time. She didn't. She was entirely composed, sir. There was no incident. Henderson looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, something between relief and a thing that wasn't quite guilt but sat in the same neighborhood. He nodded once, looked at his watch. The prince will be coming out shortly. He'll want a word with you. With me, sir. That's what I said. James stood a little straighter, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. You stood straight when the Prince of Wales wanted a word with you. It was simply what you did. Henderson disappeared back through a side door. The corridor was quiet again for 4 minutes. Then the door at the far end, the closed door, the one James had been watching all morning, opened. And Charles, Prince of Wales, future King of England, walked out into the corridor in a dark suit that probably cost more than James's monthly salary, and looked at James with eyes that were, to James's surprise, not cold or imperious or set in the expression of a man confirming that an order had been carried out. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent the morning wrestling with something that had no clean solution and had come out the other side not victorious, but simply finished, done with it for now. He walked toward James and stopped a polite distance away, closer than Camilla had stood. Different kind of proximity. It was not strategic. It was simply how he moved, with less management of distance than a man in his position might have been expected to maintain. Corporal Ellery, he said. Sir, I understand the Duchess came by this morning. Yes, sir. At 7:22. I explained a restriction. She accepted and withdrew. The prince nodded slowly. He was looking at a point somewhere around James's shoulder, not avoiding his eyes, just thinking. The way people look at a middle distance when the thing they are actually looking at is inside their own head. She didn't give you trouble? No, sir. She was perfectly composed. The prince did something with his mouth that might, in a different face, have been a smile. It was too complicated to be a smile. It was the expression of a man hearing something about a person he knows very well and finding it entirely consistent with everything he knows. No, he said quietly. She wouldn't. A pause, long enough to have a texture to it. Thank you, Corporal, the prince said. You did your job exactly as I asked. Sir, the prince looked at him then, directly, fully, with the particular weight of someone who is used to looking at people as they receive things from him, rather than as equals in a transaction. He held it for a moment. It matters, the prince said, that the people in this house know that my instructions mean what they say. Yes, sir. Even when following them is uncomfortable. Yes, sir. The prince nodded again, turned, walked back down the corridor toward his door, and James watched him go. The dark suit, the slight heaviness in the shoulders, the walk of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has simply learned to carry it upright. The door closed. The corridor was empty again. James stood in the quiet and thought about what had just happened and about what had not been said in those two conversations, what Camilla's folder had contained, what the prince had been doing behind that door for 3 hours, what had happened between them that had required a corridor to be locked and a guard to stand in it. He did not know. He would not know all of it for several more days. But he stood there in the beeswax and toast quiet of that corridor, and something settled in him. Not pride exactly, but the thing that sits just beneath pride. The knowledge that he had been placed somewhere that mattered, and he had held it, and the holding had meant something. Outside, the October sky had committed at last. It had gone gray and full and low, the kind of sky that means business. The first rain was coming. Inside Clarence's house, the morning ended. The afternoon began, and somewhere in the house, two people who had known each other for most of their adult lives, who had rebuilt their relationship piece by careful piece from the rubble of one of the most publicly documented disasters in royal history, were moving through their separate spaces in a house that held them both. Not in conflict, not in coldness, but in the particular tension of two people who have something to say to each other and are waiting with the patience of people accustomed to waiting for the right moment to say it. The corridor was just a corridor again, but it was never going to be entirely just a corridor again. By Wednesday morning, the rain had settled in properly. The kind of English rain that does not announce itself or apologize. It simply arrives and takes up residence as though it had always lived there. It ran down the tall windows of Clarence's house in long diagonal lines, and it turned the garden into something watercolor and soft, and it gave the interior of the house a new quality, more contained, more pressurized, like the lid had been pressed down on a jar. James noticed the rain first because he noticed everything. He noticed it, and then he noticed, arriving behind it, that the house had continued its Tuesday mood into Wednesday without interruption. The pressure had not released. If anything, it had tightened. He learned things in the small hours of a posting, the way you learn things in any close-quarters environment. Not through disclosure, not through anyone sitting you down and explaining the situation, but through accumulation. The way Henderson held his shoulders. The particular pitch of voices in lower corridors. The rhythm of the kitchen, which either ran smooth and easy or ran with the clipped efficiency of people compensating for tension upstairs. On Wednesday morning, the kitchen was running fast and tight. That told James something. He did not ask what. That was not his job. He stood in his corridor and held his post and watched. At 8:15, a woman named Margaret arrived. Margaret was the Duchess's personal assistant, a title that did not begin to cover the actual territory of the role. She was 53, had worked for the Duchess for 11 years, and had the manner of a person who has operated at close range to significant power for long enough that they no longer find it either impressive or intimidating. She found it, by this point, primarily administrative. She appeared at the top of the staircase and approached James's post with a folder, not burgundy this time, navy blue, and the expression of a woman executing a specific task. "Corporal Ellery," she said. "Morning," he said. "The Duchess has sent this for the prince." She extended the navy folder. "She's asked that it be delivered to him personally." James looked at the folder. He looked at Margaret. He thought about Tuesday morning, about the burgundy folder under Camilla's arm, about the question she had asked him, "Is he all right?" and about the way her face had done that small private thing before she turned and walked away. He took the folder. "I'll see it gets to him." Margaret gave him a look that managed, with remarkable economy, to convey both thank you and make sure before she turned and descended the stairs. James held the folder. It was sealed with a small brass clasp, not locked, just fastened, and it was, he noted, slightly thicker than it looked. He thought about this for a moment. He thought about what a folder sent by a duchess to a prince, through a guard, after a morning of blocked corridor access, was likely to contain. He thought about it, and then he stopped thinking about it, because it was not his business. He carried the folder to the end of the corridor and knocked on the door with the precise, firm knock that indicated official communication rather than intrusion. 3 beats, equally spaced. A pause. Come. He entered. The prince's study was smaller than people tended to imagine. It was not a throne room, not a grand chamber with 20-foot ceilings, and the kind of furniture that looks like it would refuse to be sat on. It was a working room. Books, actual books with cracked spines and paper markers sticking out of them, stacked on shelves and on the corners of the desk. Photographs on the desk and the windowsill, the kind that accumulate over a life rather than being placed there for effect. A worn armchair near the window, facing the garden, and on the arm of the armchair a cold cup of tea. The prince was at his desk. He looked up when James entered. He was in shirt sleeves, jacket over the back of his chair, and he looked, in this unguarded version, different from the man who had walked out of the study the previous morning. Less armored, more simply tired. "Sir." James extended the folder. "From the Duchess, sir. Her assistant delivered it this morning." The prince looked at the folder the way you look at something you've been both expecting and dreading. He reached out and took it. He held it in both hands for a moment without opening it, and James, who was supposed to be already retreating, found himself in the awkward position of having entered at the wrong moment. Not the wrong moment for the delivery, but the wrong moment for whatever was happening on the prince's face. He retreated. "Sir." "Wait," the prince said. James stopped. The prince opened the folder. He looked at the first page for a long moment. Not reading quickly, reading the way you read something you need to understand rather than simply process. His jaw moved slightly, the small movement of a man working through language and finding it resistant. Then he set the folder on his desk, open, and looked out the window at the gray garden and the gray rain. "Do you know what's in here?" he asked. "No, sir." "No." He said it not as a correction, but as a confirmation of something he already knew. He looked at the folder again. "She wants to talk. She's been wanting to talk since Monday." James said nothing. This was not his conversation to enter. "Monday," the prince repeated. He was talking almost to the window now. I needed time. To think. You can't think here." He gestured, vaguely, at the house around him. "Everything here is watched. Everything has weight. Even thinking has weight." He paused. "I needed the corridor to be quiet." "Yes, sir." The prince looked at him. Directly. He seemed to register, for the first time, that he was speaking to a guard rather than his own internal monologue, and there was a brief flicker of something. Not embarrassment, exactly, but a kind of recognition. He had said more than he intended. "Forgive me," he said. "That was, sir, I didn't hear anything," James said. The prince looked at him for a moment. Then, the complicated non-smile returned. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you did." He closed the folder, set it neatly at the corner of his desk, picked up a pen from the desk. Not to write, just to hold the way people hold things when they need something in their hands. "She's a practical woman," the prince said. "Camilla." "She doesn't," he stopped. Turned the pen in his fingers. "She doesn't waste words. So when she sends something like this, it means she's been thinking for some time." He looked at the folder. "Which means I've made her wait longer than was fair." "Sir, you don't need to say anything, Corporal." He set the pen down. He looked out the window again at the rain. "I'll need a reply sent back. I'll write it now. Give me 20 minutes. "Yes, sir." James retreated to the corridor and closed the door behind him and stood in the blue-carpeted quiet and thought about what had just happened, which was that the Prince of Wales had, for approximately 4 minutes, spoken to him as though he were a person rather than a post. As though proximity and the particular honesty that comes from rain-heavy mornings and sealed folders had eroded, briefly, the usual careful distance. He thought about this. He thought about what it meant to operate at close range to people who carried extraordinary amounts of private weight in very public lives. He thought about Monday, whatever Monday had contained, whatever had happened that required a corridor to be locked and a guard to stand in it and a duchess to be turned away. He thought about the folder. Burgundy first, then navy. 2 attempts. 2 days. He had known couples, civilian couples, ordinary people, who conducted their conflicts through exactly this kind of indirect architecture. Notes. Intermediaries. The careful management of proximity. He had always thought it was a failure of directness. Standing now in this corridor, he was less certain. Sometimes indirect architecture was not failure. Sometimes it was the only structure strong enough to hold the weight of what needed to be said. 23 minutes later, the door opened and the prince handed him a sealed envelope. White. No name on it. Just the impression of a signet ring in the wax. "To the Duchess," the prince said. "Into her hands." "Sir." James carried it down the stairs with the particular care of a man who is aware that what he is holding is not, strictly speaking, paper. He found Margaret in the lower corridor, waiting with the patience of someone who had expected to be found there. He handed her the envelope. She looked at it, at the wax seal, at the blankness where a name would have been, and something moved across her face. Not surprise. Something softer than surprise. Something that, in a different context, might have been relief. "Thank you," she said. "Just doing my job," James said. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she understood this to be both entirely true and not the whole truth. She took the envelope and walked away, and James watched her go, and then he turned and climbed back up the staircase to his corridor and took his position and stood in the rain-gray light and watched the garden through the far window as it darkened and shifted in the wet. By midday, something in the house had changed. He could not have mapped it or quantified it, but it was there in the kitchen, which had slowed down to its normal pace. In the way Henderson moved through the lower hall without the compressed look he had been wearing since Tuesday. In the house itself, which seemed to exhale slightly, like a room after a window has been opened. He held his post until 4 o'clock, when his relief arrived. A young corporal named Davies who always showed up exactly on time and always smelled of whatever he had eaten for lunch, and who had the kind of face that conveyed, without malice, that he had not yet been worn down by anything. Anything to report? Davies asked. James thought about Tuesday, about the burgundy folder, about is he all right, and the complicated non-smile and the pen turned in the prince's fingers, about the white envelope with the wax seal and no name. Quiet morning, he said. Davies nodded and took his post, and James walked down the stairs and out through the staff entrance into the October rain, and he stood for a moment in the cold of it, letting it come down on him, and he looked up at the house, at its windows, its weight, its years, and he felt the particular feeling that comes from having been, for one day, and then two, the hinge on which something turned. He did not know what the folders contained. He did not know what Monday had held. He did not know what the prince had written in that envelope or what the Duchess had read when Margaret placed it in her hands. But he had carried it. He had stood in the corridor and held the line and then carried what needed carrying from one side of silence to the other. And in a house where everything was mediated, everything was managed, everything was run through the careful machinery of protocol and hierarchy and the performance of order, he had been the thing that was real. He stood in the rain a moment longer. Then he pulled his collar up and walked toward the street, and the house rose behind him against the gray sky, and it held its stories the way it always held them. Patient, heavy, still. There are moments in any institution, any structure built on rules and hierarchy and the long practice of a particular kind of order, when the rules are not the point. When what the rules exist to protect becomes more important than the rules themselves, and the people who operate within that structure must feel their way toward the difference. James had not, on Tuesday morning, been certain he was navigating one of those moments. He had been following orders. That was what he had told himself, and it was true. But there was beneath the following of orders something else. A reading of the situation that went beyond the briefing Henderson had given him, beyond the language of the restriction, into something he could not have been taught, and had not been taught, but simply knew. The way the Duchess had asked her question, the way the prince had looked at the garden, the way the house had been holding its breath. He had felt it, and he had held his position, and he had carried the envelope when it was time to carry the envelope. And in between, he had stood in a corridor and been for 2 days the steady, unremarkable presence around which something important happened. By Thursday morning, he arrived at his post to find the corridor exactly as he had left it. Blue carpet, watery light, the smell of beeswax. Henderson met him at the base of the stairs. No jaw movement this time. No compressed expression. Normal day, Henderson said. Good, James said. Henderson looked at him for a moment with something that in anyone less controlled might have been gratitude. The prince mentioned you again. Sir, said you handled things well. He looked down at his clipboard, which he was always carrying and which James had never actually seen him write on. Commendation will go in your file. Thank you, sir. Henderson nodded and moved away, and James climbed the stairs to his corridor and took his position, and the house moved around him. The kitchen running at its normal pace, the staff moving with their normal ease, the morning pressing in through the tall windows with the particular quality of light that comes after 2 days of rain. The corridor was just a corridor, and James Ellery stood in it, as he always stood, and the house kept its secrets, as it always kept its secrets, and outside the world went on, not knowing, as the world almost never knows, how much depends on the people who stand in the ordinary spaces. The door at the end of the corridor was closed. It stayed closed. And somewhere in the house, things were being said that did not need a guard or a corridor or a sealed envelope to hold them. Things were being said directly, in the old-fashioned way, one person to another, in a room with the door shut, and no one standing outside to mediate. James thought about this. He stood straighter. That was the job. That had always been the job. The commendation went into his file on a Friday afternoon, logged by Henderson with the same minimal ceremony he applied to everything, and James learned about it not from Henderson directly, but from Davies, who had heard it from a woman in the administrative office named Susan, who had apparently told Davies with the tone of someone delivering a gift. Davies had told James with the tone of someone reporting the weather. Pleasant enough, quickly displaced by whatever came next. That was Davies. That was the nature of the rotation. Things happened, and were noted, and life moved forward on its corridor. James filed the commendation in the back of his mind the way he filed most things. Acknowledged, stored, not revisited unless necessary. It was a piece of paper. It meant something in the cumulative arithmetic of a military career, but it did not feel like the center of gravity of what had happened that week. It was the receipt. It was not the transaction. The transaction, James had come to understand over the days that followed, had been something else entirely. It took him a while to find the right word for it. He was not, by nature, a man who spent a lot of time searching for words. He was a practical person in a practical job, and most of what the job required did not need words. It needed presence, judgment, the particular steady quality of a person who remains in place when other things move. But the week had been unusual, and unusual things sometimes demand language, the way wounds demand attention. You cannot simply walk past them. The word he arrived at eventually was trust. Not his trust in the prince. Not the prince's trust in him, which was the obvious reading. The one the commendation was about, the one Henderson had referenced with the satisfaction of an institutional ledger being balanced. That was real, but it was surface. It was the declared part. The deeper thing was this, that the prince, in issuing those orders on Tuesday morning, had trusted something beyond Corporal James Ellery specifically. He had trusted that the structure would hold, that the protocols existed not as obstacles but as shelters, as the architecture inside which a person could think, grieve, argue, wrestle with something private, without the watching world pressing its face to the glass. The corridor restriction had not been about keeping Camilla out. Not truly. It had been about keeping everything else out, while two people who had spent decades navigating the most publicly managed relationship in England tried, for a few hours, to navigate something privately. James had been the door. Literally. He had stood in the corridor and been the door, and the door had held, and what had happened on the other side of it was none of his business and all of his purpose. This was not a distinction he would have been able to articulate on Tuesday morning. By Friday, it sat in him with the solidity of something understood rather than learned. He thought about this on the way home that Friday, on the tube, standing because there were no seats, holding the rail, and swaying with the movement of the train while around him ordinary London lived its ordinary life. A man reading a paperback with a cracked spine, a woman checking her phone with the focused expression of someone receiving bad news, and processing it in public, two teenagers managing earbuds, and a shared takeaway bag with the intricate coordination of long practice. He stood among them and thought about trust and corridors and what it meant to hold a position that nobody outside a very small number of rooms would ever know about or value. He thought about the question she had asked him. Is he all right? He had thought about that question more than he'd thought about almost anything else that had happened that week. He had turned it over in his head the way you turn a stone, checking the underneath, looking for what lies there. There was so much in it. The removal of title. Not as the prince well, not how is his royal highness this morning. Just him. Just is he all right? The question a person asks about someone they're worried about in the straightforward way of private worry, the kind that doesn't dress itself up. She had asked a guard. She had asked a guard who could not answer, who had his orders, who was standing between her and the answer. She had asked anyway, because sometimes you ask even when you know you won't get an answer, because the asking itself is the thing you needed to do. James had thought about this, and thought about what it meant to know someone that well. Well enough that the channel of communication could narrow all the way down to a question asked to a guard in a corridor, and still carry everything it needed to carry. He had delivered it, in the end. Not the answer, but the information beneath the answer. The prince as well, his instructions were given this morning himself. He is there, and present, and choosing this. He had delivered that in the most minimal form available to him, within the limits of his orders, because there was a human being asking him a human question, and there was no protocol in any handbook that required him to be entirely a wall. That had been, he decided, the right call. He was not certain it was the approved call. He was certain it was the right one. The train moved, and the city moved outside the windows, and James held the rail and swayed and let the week settle in him. And it settled the way things settle when they are real. Not with drama, not with the clean narrative arc of a story that knows where it's going, but with the messy, specific weight of actual events. The burgundy folder, the navy folder, Henderson's jaw, the cold tea on the arm of the worn chair, the pen turned in the prince's fingers, the white envelope with a wax seal and no name placed in Margaret's hands, Margaret's face doing the thing that was softer than surprise. He got off the train 2 stops later than he needed to. He didn't notice until he was on the platform. He turned, looked at the board, saw the next train was 4 minutes away. He stood on the platform and waited. The following Monday, James arrived at his post to find the corridor unchanged. Blue carpet, beeswax, the particular quality of morning light that Clarence House produced, slightly underwater, slightly golden, the collision of old architecture and English autumn doing something specific to the air. He took his position, and the shift ran as shifts run, without event, without drama, without deviation from the ordinary. Henderson appeared mid-morning with a different expression than usual, a new one that James categorized, after a moment's consideration, as satisfied. Not warmly satisfied. Henderson was not a warm man, but satisfied in the way of a man whose mechanism has performed its function correctly and who is, in some compartment of himself, gratified by this. Smooth morning? Henderson asked. Very, James said. Henderson looked at him. There was something behind his eyes that moved, a calculation being run and concluded, and then he nodded and said nothing else and moved away, and James was left again in the quiet corridor with the portraits and the sconces and the garden visible through the far window, beginning to take on the specific bronze of late October. The week moved. Normal shifts, normal briefings, normal rotation with Davies, who continued to smell of his lunches and to arrive exactly on time and to ask what to report and to receive the answer quiet morning and to take it at face value, which was one of Davies's better qualities. On Wednesday of that week, James was descending the main staircase at the end of his shift when he heard footsteps ascending from below. He moved to the right out of habit. Staff kept right on the stairs, always, and looked up and found himself face to face with Camilla. She stopped on the step below him. He was 1 step above. They were briefly at eye level. She looked at him for a moment. He had the sense that she had seen him before she rounded the turn, that she had prepared for this encounter in the 2 seconds available to her, which he could see it in her eyes, quite capable of doing. Corporal Ellery, she said, Your Royal Highness. A pause. She did not look away. I believe I owe you an apology. He blinked. Your Royal Highness, I put you in a difficult position last Tuesday. You handled it with great courtesy. I am grateful. She said it cleanly, directly, without performance. It was the voice she had used to ask, is he all right? The undressed voice, the one that didn't manage itself. James thought about saying it was nothing, which it was not. He thought about saying he was just doing his job, which was true but felt inadequate. He said, You were entirely gracious about it, Your Royal Highness. She looked at him. Her expression did something complicated and private and then settled into something that he might, in someone he knew better, have called rueful. I was not entirely gracious, she said. I thought I was being denied something I was entitled to. I've had some time since to consider that I was, in fact, being given something. She paused. Time, which is sometimes what people need. James said nothing. He held the railing and stood on his step and let her words sit in the stairwell without rushing to fill around them. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she nodded, not the formal nod of rank to rank, but the nod of a person concluding a conversation they needed to have. Thank you, she said. Your Royal Highness. She ascended past him. He descended. They did not look back. On the landing below, he stopped for a moment and let the stairwell do its quiet thing around him. The sound of her footsteps on the floor above, the distant suggestion of the kitchen, the house breathing its patient, old breath. She had said something he had not expected. I was being given something. Time, which is sometimes what people need. He had stood in a corridor for 3 hours and blocked a woman from a room, and she had found a way to construe it as a gift. Not generously, not charitably. He did not think she was the kind of person who required herself to be charitable about things. She had thought about it and found the truth in it. The prince had needed the corridor to be quiet, and the corridor had been quiet, and whatever the folders had held and whatever the white envelope had contained, something had been navigated. Something had been found, and she could see now that the closed corridor had been part of how it was found. James climbed out of this thought the way you climb out of cold water, aware of it, letting it drain. He walked through the staff corridor to the cloakroom, retrieved his coat and bag, pushed through the heavy door into the London afternoon. It was not raining. For the first time in a week, the sky had cleared. Not fully, not warmly, but with the thin, precise clarity of late October, the kind of sky that gives you light without heat, visibility without comfort. The trees along the street had turned orange and ochre and the specific red that looks in this light like the color of something ending. He walked. He thought about what he would tell his sister on Sunday when she called. He would tell her nothing about this, obviously. That was the job. The job was also silence, not just standing and watching and holding, but carrying and being done with the carrying, setting it down when you left the building, not bleeding the thing that happened inside the walls into the ordinary world outside them. He would tell her he'd had a quiet week. She would ask again about meeting someone nice. He would say he was working on it, which was what he always said, which was mostly true. He turned the corner onto the main street. The city was doing its Monday afternoon thing. Purposeful, packed, indifferent to the specifics of individual lives, each person sealed inside their own particular circumstance and carrying it through the crowd. He was one of them. He was always, ultimately, one of them. But he had stood in a corridor at the center of something that mattered, and he had held it, and the holding had been good work. He was certain of that. Whatever he had been a part of, whatever had moved, shifted, been resolved, or set in motion in those rooms behind the closed door, he had been a part of it in the only way available to him. Steady, present, reliable as a wall. He thought, without quite meaning to, about what the wall metaphor meant for him as opposed to what it had meant in the context of Camilla's question. She had not meant him when she asked, "Is he all right?" She had meant someone else, someone the wall was protecting. But James had been the wall, and walls are not nothing. Walls are not decoration. Walls are what allow a room to exist. He had been a room's ability to exist. He was enough at peace with this. The evening was coming in, purple-gray at the edges, the streetlights beginning to make their case against the dark. James walked home through a city that did not know his name or his post or the weight of the 2 folders and the 1 envelope that had passed through his hands this week. The city didn't need to know. The city had its own concerns, its own corridors, its own closed doors, and the people standing in front of them. He was not special. He had always known this and found it, on the whole, not discouraging. You did not need to be special to matter. You needed to show up. You needed to be where you were supposed to be, when you were supposed to be there in the full sense of being, not just physically present, but actually there awake, reading the situation, feeling the weight of things, making the call when the call needed making. He had done that. And in the long history of that house, in all the weight and years and portraits and secrets it held, one Corporal James Ellery would leave no trace. No plaqué. No record beyond a file commendation and the memory of 3 people who had been in the corridor and on the stairs. Nothing else. Nothing else was needed. He turned his key in his door, climbed the stairs to his flat, put the kettle on, stood at the window while it boiled, and looked at the street below, at the cars and the people and the specific ordinary texture of an evening in the city, and he felt the week settle into him the rest of the way. Completed. Filed. Done. The kettle clicked off. He made his tea without sugar because he had given up sugar in January for reasons he still could not entirely remember, and he sat in his chair by the window, and he drank it while it was still hot, and the city went on outside, and the house went on without him, the way houses do. Patient. heavy. Still, this is a work of dramatic fiction. All characters, events, and dialogue are fictional and imagined. This story is inspired by the culture and atmosphere of the British royal household and does not depict or claim to represent any real events, conversations, or actions involving real individuals.